And we're live. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Today we have Shaiel Ben-Ephraim on the program. For those who don't know, Shaiel is one of the Twitter accounts I actually follow the most thoroughly. We've shouted him out on this program multiple times. As we often discuss, there's a sea of mis and disinformation out there, and most people don't have the time to just go deep on the research. So it's good to find a few accounts that you could trust. And trusting an account doesn't mean you should blindly trust them. It's still good to verify at times, but it is good to find those people out there who can synthesize things for you in a way that is easy to understand. So Shaiel has actually been one of those people for me, and we've shouted him out on the show many times. So it's a pleasure to have him. A little bit more about him: he hosts the History of the Land of Israel podcast and Israel Explained YouTube channel. He's a former Israeli diplomat and has a Ph.D. in military strategy. His book about U.S. policy towards the Israeli settlements is coming out later this year. You could find links to all of his links to all this in the description. Shaiel, it is a pleasure to have you.
Absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah. I'm sending you also, I was going to try to do this in real time, but I'm sending you now the Twitter link just in case you want to retweet it.
Okay.
I wasn't able to multitask and do it while I was introing like I thought I'd be able to.
Only women can multitask properly, I'm told.
Right. Exactly. I've been working on it, but it's a struggle, a daily struggle. And for those who don't see a new backdrop, I'm actually back in Israel, Herzliya to be exact. Interestingly, Herzliya is named after Theodor Herzl. Back in this beautiful and oh so complicated land. Cool. So Shaiel, let's talk about what's going on. The current state of the war. And I frame this as a debate. I think there's a lot of alignment between us, but I'm sure we'll find some differences to discuss. So
I'm just going to pounce on everything you say.
Yeah, go for it. That we welcome that on this channel. So.
No, but even if it's true.
Well, they do say, I don't like perpetuating stereotypes, but they say 10 Jews, 11 opinions. So we're going to find something to argue about. So I'm looking forward,
Yeah. So you want me to give a brief?
Yeah. State of the war.
Yeah. Well, right now there really isn't much of a war. There's some military action going on. There's soldiers dying, but there's no major strategic goal in the operation in Gaza. So there was all this talk about Rafah and how important Rafah was, and that Rafah would determine the entire conflict. And when that came up, there was some truth to that, because at that time the IDF was sitting in Khan Yunis. They had isolated Gaza City, so Rafah was really the only place where Hamas was ruling a large part of the population. But since the IDF left Khan Yunis before they went into Rafah, the importance of Rafah was immediately decreased. So Israel went into Rafah, killed, according to the IDF, 900 terrorists, and took over Philadelphia corridor, which was very important to do, but you didn't have to go into and take over all of Rafah to do that. And now that they're done with that, they're just going to keep maintaining in other areas. Mowing the grass is the charming term that the IDF uses for those kind of operations, and disrupting infrastructure, trying to kill heads of Hamas, trying to free hostages when possible. But there is no real goal to take over all of Gaza, to replace the government. The IDF has a plan for what they call humanitarian bubbles, which is a plan. I would describe it as a plan that they came up with because all the more substantive plans that they came up with had been vetoed by the government. So it's sort of the most bare bones, minimal plan to distribute humanitarian aid. It's not really a day after plan in any sense. And so because there is no real goal left in Gaza to do, because that would require taking over Gaza, having a day after plan, governing Gaza, all those sorts of things. Right now, the IDF and the government are planning a pivot to Lebanon to fight against Hezbollah. But of course, Hezbollah is only firing at Israel because of the war in Gaza. Or at least that's what they say. They're only firing at Israel because of the war in Gaza. They say if the war in Gaza was to stop, they would stop firing. So we have a little bit of a paradox here right now, which is that Israel has achieved most of what it's going to achieve in Gaza by its own admission, and is going into Lebanon to stop something that could be stopped if they stop the operation in Gaza. So meanwhile, there's a third front in the West Bank where several soldiers have died recently from IEDs. And because the PA is getting weaker there, that could turn into a major front as well. So we could end up with a war that's not over in Gaza, a much bigger war in Lebanon, because Hezbollah makes Hamas look like a walk in the park. And a third front, probably the least intensive, but still pretty intensive, in the West Bank. Then there's also the possibility of Iran joining. So Israel's on the verge of starting a multi-front war involving several Iranian regional proxies. And the question is there any point to it right now? Because if a deal can be reached with Hamas, that could be stopped. The hostages could be brought out. So, but of course, Hamas is making it very difficult by being the impossible negotiating partner that they are. So Israel is really stuck in a bind, but its decision to expand at a time when it's been unable to achieve the most important goals in Gaza, which are dismantling Hamas and replacing it as a governing body and killing Sinwar and freeing the hostages, begs the question of why Israel thinks that it's going to achieve any of the goals that it needs to achieve in Lebanon.
So to summarize what you said, it's a disaster, pretty much.
It's a disaster, but that's charitable, because right now it's a disaster. We're on the verge of it turning into a much, much bigger disaster. So I've talked to some people and I've seen some estimates of what happens if Israel goes to war with Hezbollah. It's believed that there'll be 2,500 to 3,500 rockets and missiles every single day, hitting every part of Israel all the way to the Negev, focusing on infrastructure, because what they've learned is from the war in Ukraine, that if you focus on infrastructure, you can lower the morale of the people and the efficiency of the fight back. Right. The Israeli, the CEO of the electricity corporation of the government, said that Israel is not prepared, and that there could be loss of power for a very long time. That was controversial. He said that if there is a loss of power for too long, Israel will cease to exist, which sounds dramatic, but he's very concerned. He's very concerned. And we've seen that Israel's reaction to most crises has been pretty inept. And we have no reason to believe that in a bigger crisis involving Hezbollah, there'll be any less inept. That's my main concern with the war in Lebanon, is that, I can imagine the war being run well, but I can't imagine the current government running it well, because I haven't seen them run anything well. So how do you even get out of that war? And how do you defeat Hezbollah? I mean, you would have to go into Beirut. Even if you went into Beirut, they would go further north in Lebanon. And we remember what happened last time Israel went into Beirut. Right. And Lebanon is a lot bigger than Gaza, and we still haven't been able to take over all of Gaza. So I'm not really sure what the end game is here. And constantly saying we have no choice, which is what people who advocate for this government say, isn't necessarily accurate, because Hamas is saying that they're willing to reach a deal if Israel gives guarantees that the war will end, which is a defeat for Israel. It's totally a defeat for Israel. But is this defeat better than the defeat that we could be facing if Hezbollah escalates and Israel is unable to handle that?
Right.
That could be an existential risk to Israel in the longer term.
Yeah, when I try to, when I look at all the destruction, October 7th and every day afterwards, whether it's the destruction of Gaza or just the destruction of our image in the global community, if it's the fact that Hamas is more popular than ever before, the fact that we've sacrificed over 300 more of our own to not really achieve all too much. 60,000 people in the north are not in their homes. I try to say, what possible outcome can we achieve to make me say, you know what, maybe it was worth it. And as time passes, it's getting harder and harder to see a possible outcome that would make this cost worth it. One thing that comes to mind is that maybe it shifts Israeli mentality to understand, almost humbles us to understand that we cannot continue to live by the sword. And if we want to thrive on this land, it will not be through war. It'll be through diplomacy and achieving peace. And it's true, having a strong military can help us negotiate. But this whole idea of neglecting the peace process altogether and even ridiculing those and mocking those who are involved in the peace process as naive, well, it seems like it was actually naive to think that we could just continue to fight for eternity. So that's one positive I hope comes out of it. And the other, and it's seeming, I don't know the likelihood of this happening, is a change in the status quo in Gaza, right? And a change in the status quo would mean new leadership, or somehow a new negotiation with Hamas and having them compromise, recognizing Israel's right to exist, which I don't know if there's a high likelihood of it, but I think it's within the realm of possible. But it seems like right now we're looking towards the same status quo as before, not returning the hostages because we don't want to end the war, and all of this for nothing. I don't know. So what are your thoughts on that? What good do you think can come out of it, or what do you hope comes out of it?
Yeah, so the first point is very salient, which is that military defeats or military, wars where no one wins have some good downstream effects quite often. Israel has fallen into this trap of relying too much on its military power before, which is it's understandable because Israel's enemies are very, very difficult to talk to. And in the past, were relatively easy to defeat. So, it's kind of an easy trap to fall into. But Israel fell into this trap in 1967. And then in 1973, it learned the hard way that continuing wars with Egypt would lead to a disaster. And that helped reach peace. Of course, we can't forget that Sadat also played a huge role in that, because no matter how much Israel felt that way, if Sadat hadn't done what he'd done, they couldn't have done much about it. But then we have the other case, which is probably a better example, which is the First Intifada. In the First Intifada, Israel was unable, using military, to defeat it. It was a war that was more complicated. It was a war that put Israel in a very bad position in the PR-wise. It was able to achieve some goals militarily, but it couldn't really defeat it militarily. So it had to move to diplomacy. That was a painful process that took several years. I'm old enough to remember it as a child, and that when I wrote my doctoral thesis, I said that the only way there's going to be peace is if there's a sharp shock to the status quo, because the status quo is that Israel ignores the Palestinian issue. That means that also the U.S. ignores the Palestinian issue, because the U.S. goes by immediate incentives. So only a shock would make a change. Well, this was a bigger shock than I expected, a much bigger shock than I expected. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know it would be this. And if a status quo was leading by definition to continuation only of the conflict, which is where we were, breaking the status quo could, in the long term, lead to peace. But it will take years. So I don't think it'll happen today or tomorrow, but more Israelis today feel like you can't just rely on the military to win, just like you said. Feel like attempts to bypass and ignore the Palestinians didn't work. Of course, some of them are coming to the other conclusion, which is that you need to, relocate them, transfer, ethnic cleansing. That's the danger, because most people were comfortable with the status quo, and now they're not. So does that mean that they're going more towards peace, or are they going more towards ethnic cleansing and war crimes? Right now, I'm seeing more of the opposite. Of course, the ethnic cleansing, it's not a realistic solution. You can't actually do it. So maybe people will calm down. So yeah, I can see that. And then you also have people in Gaza, lots of people in Gaza, who are thinking Hamas is not the answer. How much that comes to fruition, a lot of that depends also on us, and that brings us to the second thing you asked, which is what would make this a success, or is there any way that would be worth it? So I would say that the most important caveat about calling this a disaster is to remember what happened in the Second Lebanon War. Second Lebanon War, everyone said it was a disaster. It wasn't quite this bad. Well, it was maybe worse operationally, but better strategically, is how I would put it. It wasn't a great war. And when Israel finished it, everyone thought that Israel had lost. But as it turned out, it had deterred Hezbollah for quite a while. Now, Hezbollah knew there was going to be another round, and there is another round happening right now, but it's almost 20 years. If you deter your enemy for 17 years in the Middle East, that's a lot. By Israeli terms, that's a lot. That war, in retrospect, was almost a success. So what people who are arguing in favor of this war are saying, and they have a point, is that Israel has destroyed Gaza so much that no matter how much they say, oh, we're going to continue fighting, rah, 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 they don't want to fight, and they won't want to fight for a long time. And if you look at what Hamas is asking for, they're asking for 5 years of rebuilding. In that time, they're not going to do anything out of their own interests to finish the rebuilding. And even then, how long before they're ready to strike, right? So there's definitely, I think that deterrence that Israel achieved versus Hezbollah has probably already been achieved. Sure, they're in the middle of a war now. They're not going to surrender. But when are they going to want to do this again? It will be a long time before they want to do this again. And that's why I think it's a good option right now, or not a terrible option, to stop and get out the hostages. Because then you have two achievements. You have the hostages, and you have possibly, I believe, a certain level of deterrence. That's by no means a victory, but it's not a complete and total waste. And a lot of people say, and this maybe we have a disagreement, Israel shouldn't have gone on this offensive to begin with. I disagree, because I think the deterrence that Israel gained, even if it achieves none of its strategic goals, had to occur. Just like I say, very unpopular opinion, the war in Afghanistan had to occur after 9/11. You can't, after an attack like that, just sit and say, okay, now obviously it's better if your attack is well planned and well executed and you achieve stuff. But even if you don't, you can't afford to just let this kind of thing happen. So what Israel needs to do now is stop it from being a complete defeat and achieve some goals.
Cool. So that actually helped broaden my perspective, at least on the deterrence front. And I guess there's two directions I want to take this. I'll start with one, and hopefully we could loop it around. When it comes to what I think we should have done, and maybe this is an area. Hold on. Can you hear that background noise?
I heard a little bit.
That's the problem being in Marina Herzliya. You get some passerbyers.
Great place.
Yeah. So part of me says, I think there's a way we could have gone about it without responding militarily. But I also try to ground my ideas in realistic solutions, and it's not a viable solution given what the Israeli public wants, right? So like, even if Netanyahu said, you know what, I'm going to approach this completely differently, I think he wouldn't have been able to actually do it. I don't think he would have had a coalition to do it, right? So there's an expectation, and this is this Israel is a very militaristic society, but we see this in pretty consistently across the board. Around 70% of Americans supported the war in Iraq, and there weren't even great pretenses there. So it's not hard for a population to agree to engage in a war for their perceived security, right? So, and after October 7th, it's what are you going to tell the public? We're not going to go after them. We're going to try diplomacy now. I don't think there's a case that realistically could have been made. I do, however, think the war could have been done much more carefully. I think there's a serious lack of discipline among soldiers, which have amounted to war crimes. Some of them, they're even just filming the more minor ones, like stealing shit, burning shit down, blowing up buildings like the Parliament building, for example. We're seeing a certain excess there, and we don't know what's not being filmed. But like, just one clear example, we heard a lot of reports of people being executed and sniped. You could always cast doubt, say that's misinformation. If a video comes out, you could say, how do we know that's not Hamas? But then there's an instance of like the 3 Israeli hostages that escaped, and they were all shot dead waving white flags. There was probably a culture, again, not amongst all units, but some units have a culture of shoot first, ask questions later. I think kind of having a much higher degree of discipline would have reduced the harm to civilian life. And also just when it came to our airstrikes, I think we had a much lower level of proportionality to any other time we've engaged in Gaza, and the toll has, the civilian death toll has been tremendous. Again, like we need to keep in mind, yeah, there's infrastructure that's strategic to blow up, but Hamas is underground in tunnels. It's the civilians that have nowhere to hide. So I think there's a lot we could have done differently. But I do understand that to say we shouldn't have gone in at all probably isn't the most realistic. Would you?
Yeah. So I basically agree with what you're saying about how Israel's conducted the war, but I think it's important to separate where the problem lies. It's much more on the lower ranks than it is in the higher ranks of the military. I've been talking to a lot of people in the IDF, and what I'm hearing is it's very disturbing too, but it's a bit of a complex picture. You have a amount of anger in Israel after October 7th that is almost unmanageable. The hatred that the average Israeli has for the people in Gaza is hard to relate to non-Israelis. But I'll just say that the day October 7th happened, the conversation I most remember is with my most left-wing friend, my almost anti-Zionist Israeli friend. And he was saying we need to go into Gaza and kill everyone. That's what he said that day. Now, he's gone back to being a lefty since, right? But not as left as he was, and that's what he said that day. And that gives you some example. And now imagine what the right-wingers think. And most young Israelis are somewhere on the right-wing spectrum. Imagine what they think.
Right.
So you have that anger in the ranks. Then you also have the Israeli people right now, especially early on, but still now, felt that the army were heroes. They were like gods, you know. Soldiers were saying that women were throwing themselves at them and all this kind of stuff. They were like absolute heroes. So the result was you had a lot of soldiers with a lot of anger who you also couldn't really discipline without getting a lot of political pushback. And remember who's the government. We have some very extreme nationalists in there who are just looking for the army to make an example out of someone who shows indiscipline, to pounce and say, these are the left-wing traitors who caused October 7th. So the higher ranks are aware of a lack of discipline. They're aware that it harms the strategic goals. They're aware that it could also serve as evidence in The Hague. And they also are aware of the moral problems, believe it or not. I'm not saying this to you. I'm saying this to maybe some of the viewers. The IDF commanders actually care if Palestinians die. At least a lot of them do. So they're worried about all this stuff. But disciplining the soldiers is almost impossible politically. The days when a commander could come and say to his soldier, you know, you have to cut this out and go to the jail for 30 days or all that stuff, those days are gone. If you do that now, there's a show trial with Ben Gvir and Smotrich in the media. We saw that with the Elior Azaria case when Elior Azaria killed a terrorist on the ground. And that was a war crime because he had been neutralized. And that turned into a cause celeb for the right wing in Israel. And now it would be 100 times more because as popular as the military was at the time, it was peacetime. And now, if you try anything like that, the parents would go and raise havoc in the media, and half of the Knesset would be on their side, and the commander would end up being fired. Now, they're not showing any profiles in courage here by not handling this well. I'm not really excusing this, but that's why there's a lack of discipline. So the soldiers are doing whatever they want. The commanders know that it's bad, and they're not stopping it. The war crimes are happening, but I will say, from the command, when they saw that some of their bombing strategies were killing too many civilians and other things like that, they changed the strategy. That's why there's less casualties. And that's been good for Israel and for the Palestinians. The amount of casualties, Sinwar says, he said in the Wall Street Journal, quoted his internal messaging saying that the more people die, the better it is for Hamas. It's good
Correct.
for their public relations. They can't win on the battlefield. They can only win in PR. So everything that Israel does that's a war crime is also helping Hamas. But it's important to note the Israeli government, problematic as it is, and the Israeli high command, less problematic but also problematic, are not ordering war crimes, with the possible exception of early on the blockade when they tried to stop aid from coming in. That didn't last very long, but that was arguably, but that was the early moments of
Right.
anger. The Israeli policy is not one of war crimes, and that's why the ICC is going to have difficulty proving, if they ever get, Gallant or Netanyahu, which I doubt they ever will, proving war crimes, because you have to have an intention to commit them coming from the top, from the policy, not from soldiers, because every war has soldiers doing things. And I'm not sure this war is necessarily much higher level of that, although it could be. But these kids are posting it, so there's evidence everywhere. But where are the orders coming from? They're not getting orders to commit war crimes from high up. So it's a complicated and tragic situation.
Right. So yeah, I mean, I could attest to that as serving in the IDF. They used to tell us that when you're guarding, if somebody will approach you, you yell for them to stop. If they don't stop, you yell for them to stop again. If they don't stop, you shoot in the air. If they don't stop, you shoot at their legs. That was the code of conduct, but the culture was quite different, right? Many would say there was this joke. It's like one will shoot in the air while the other just shoots directly at him. You don't, and again, it's different from unit to unit, but there's a clear difference between what the code of conduct is and what the culture is. And I think Israel hasn't done nearly enough to change that culture from within. And the more this like ethnic hate builds up, the harder it is to contain. I think you gave a good explanation as to it's not as simple as just reining it in. There's a political consideration, but on the other side, we see what the cost is not only to civilian life, but also just our how we're viewed in the international community. And I do think, many people hate on these global protests, but I actually think they've made a difference. The fact that Israel has reined it in a little bit is because of the backlash they've gotten from their conduct in Gaza. I think one area where international law is very interesting and unclear is when it comes to the law of proportionality, right? It's like, let me just read it for those who are unfamiliar. I mean, I have it saved somewhere. Proportionality law. Hold on. The principle of proportionality means the incidental and involuntary harm caused to the civilian population during a military attack must not be excessive in relation to the direct military advantage gained. Okay, who's going to determine that, right? So, it shouldn't be up to the countries involved in the war to determine that. I mean, we make a calculation if this is a good level of proportionality, but then it should be these international courts that decide if we've made the right decision. And then, I think on some regard, the airstrikes we've done, I think there's a strong case to be made that hasn't been proportional. But again, there's so much subjectivity here, so we'll see what happens, right?
Yeah. So the subjectivity in proportionality isn't a bug; it's a feature. The idea behind it being vague is so that militaries won't be tempted, or will be less tempted, to be more realistic, to say, screw it, this is all unsustainable, we're fighting a war here. The way it's designed is so that militaries can say, wait a minute, I can kind of work with this, proportional, I want to achieve this, so I can bomb what helps me achieve that. And it's basically, if you look back to when these laws were designed, it's before we had anything like the ICC. The people who designed them had no intention whatsoever of this being adjudicated in an international court. In fact, if you'd asked them, they probably would have told you that would have made countries less likely to follow. What they wanted was for generals and commanders to make their own calculation, not because they think they would make the right calculation, but because they think it's better than them making no calculation at all. Because when it comes to generals and leaders at war, they're not sitting there thinking, do I want to win the war or do I want to follow the law? They only want to win the war. But if they can follow the law too, while still winning the war, you can save lives. And that's the idea behind proportionality. So it's not a mistake that the IDF determines the proportionality. That's how it's designed. And, otherwise, no one would follow it. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. We have to be realistic. During war, commanders will prefer their military operational goals over the lives of innocent civilians. History has shown that over and over again. But if we can put it in their calculations, we can save lives. And I think that the example of Gaza is an imperfect way of that working. Israel has, for various reasons, lowered the amount of civilians that are being killed, lowered the risk to civilians being killed. That's a good thing, and it's sort of international law working. International humanitarian law is not perfect. No law is perfect, and that's particularly not perfect, but it has some use.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. There's something clever about it. They're like, what's a law if it can't be enforced? And enforcing international law is much harder than enforcing a domestic law. What are you going to do? Come to Israel and arrest Bibi and Gallant, right? So it's like, okay, we need to create the law in a way that people will comply, even though it can't be enforced, or even if it's hard to be enforced.
Yeah, it wasn't meant to be enforced at all initially.
Interesting. Okay.
By domestic courts, by the court running the war, maybe, but not by international courts, because those courts didn't exist. The ICJ doesn't do that, and the ICC didn't exist. The ICC didn't exist until the 21st century. Yeah.
Okay, so we're I mean, it's good to see this progress. I do hope to see the day where there's not even an expectation of the people to respond in this way, where governments can make much more calculated decisions and not reactionary and like reactive decisions based on the will of the people or the anger of the people. So I want to give one more anecdote about the complexity of what's going on in Gaza. So a friend of mine was recently in Gaza as a reservist. He came out and he was sharing with me some stuff. And there was one incident where they saw a few Hamas soldiers. One had an RPG, the others had guns. I think it was three total. And they were actually walking with children, right? And I was actually a little bit skeptical about the human shields. Like, if you want to say they use human shields in the sense that they embed themselves heavily within civilian infrastructure, I think that's obvious. But I didn't see much evidence, not photo evidence or a clear case that they're actually walking with children. But this is a friend who has no reason to lie to me. So he told me this is what they saw. And then they asked, and one of the people there was identified by Israeli intelligence to be somebody who's wanted, right? They asked for permission to shoot. Now, you shoot at a distance. It's heavy. You're shooting tanks. You're shooting like heavy gunnery. You can't precision just take these guys out. They asked for permission to take them out. They got a response back. No, you don't have permission. Now, then the soldiers were complaining, oh, that sucks. We would have taken them all out. We don't care if they would have died. So this is showing a few different dynamics. One, Hamas and how there's occasions where they're actually walking with children and civilians to protect themselves, and then a tension between the higher up commands and the lower level soldiers. There's kind of like a tug and pull there. Sometimes the soldiers will get their way. Sometimes they won't even go up to the higher to ask for permission. They'll just shoot, right? But so we're seeing that dynamic in place. So I found that to be very interesting.
Yeah. Let me comment on that. So first of all, that shows the first thing that I was saying about the higher up. The higher up you are in command, the more they take us into account. That's for sure. So when you have commanders of you go up, brigade, you go up to the division level. The higher up you go, the more people care.
Right.
And we're seeing that. By the way, it doesn't mean that none of the regular soldiers do. Lots of them do. Lots of them are great people. But too many of them are 18-year-old right wingers who hate Palestinians. and
Right,
all that
right.
it implies.
And they believe there's no civilians in Gaza, right?
And they believe there's
Someone
no
else,
civilians in Gaza. And our propaganda, when I say our, I mean Zionist, Israeli, continues to say that as if it's some kind of selling point when it's actually something that works against us and makes us look bad. But that's a different point.
Yeah,
But
even we did a paid ad. That was one of the worst things I saw. Like Israel put out a paid ad on Twitter about no civil. I think they took it down. Like, I don't know, whoever did that should be fired.
They did. I know who did it. And after I called them out, they unfollowed me on Twitter. Total disaster and reflects how. But that's the PR. We'll talk. Well, I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Yeah.
But the other thing that you mentioned is Hamas using human shields. And I think this is an important point. You and I are, by Zionist standards, we're lefties. And
traitors, according to some.
We're traitors. And there's a danger that guys like us have, and gals, and whatever their gender is, like us have, it's of trying to make the enemy look better than they are in order to encourage peace, right? But the truth is, with Hamas, we just can't do that. Everything that Hamas is accused of doing, maybe there's some exaggerations here and there. Everything that Hamas is accused of doing, they do. Hamas are the worst actors imaginable. And I have seen videos of them with holding children while walking from one place to another. And so what you're saying is not surprising. They do this stuff all the time. This is not only something it's not even something that they do because they're evil. They are evil, but it's their strategy. Because you saw it. First of all, it saved their lives in the case that you mentioned. And if it doesn't save their lives, they can say Israel's slaughtering innocent children.
Right.
So either way, they win. If they weren't there with the children, then you could just take them out, and then they would just lose. So it makes sense from their perspective to do it. So why wouldn't they do it? Because they care about children in Gaza? They don't care about children in Gaza. If they cared, this war would never have happened. That's just a fact. They brought the Israeli military onto their children intentionally. Not because they were like, oh, we have no choice. No, come in. We're going to place our children in front of you. You kill them. We'll go to the media. And that way we'll knock you down. That's what Hamas does. They're an evil organization. And there's no point in sugarcoating what they are. I'm not saying you were, but there's this tendency to be like, well, they're not so bad because we want people to make peace. But with Hamas, we just can't do that. They're just the worst.
Yeah. So I think actually the way they're described, they're much worse than how the average anti-Israel person would describe them. But I actually think they're not as bad as the average pro-Israel person would describe them.
Hamas themselves or the civilians?
No, and actually Hamas themselves. And I don't. It's such a trigger topic, but like, even a lot of the. We'll get into this briefly. I don't want to get stuck on this, but there's October 7th was horrific, right? There was a brutal massacre against civilians, but a lot of the stories that were popularized were simply untrue or unproven. Like one of them was one that is now admitted to not be to be proven to not be true, was the 40 beheaded babies. But now, once all the names have been released, we actually know that one baby was killed on October 7th. Very few Israelis actually know that. We know who she was. Her name was Mila Cohen. She was an infant. She was killed. Again, this doesn't mean it wasn't a horrific atrocity. But if you speak to the average person, they'll say they burned people alive. They cut a baby out of a woman's stomach. Hamas ordered mass rape. And again, I'm not saying there wasn't instances of sexual violence, but I don't think there's evidence of it being systemic and mass the way it's constantly described. And then there was the saying all the women hostages are now pregnant. And again, we've had around 100 women hostages be released. One of them claims she was sexually assaulted. Amit Susanna, she should certainly be believed. But the other ones, for the most part, were treated pretty decent. And honestly, they're explaining to be their reports are not so different from how Palestinian prisoners are being treated. I think the case could be even made. Palestinians are coming back saying they're treated worse. This isn't a defense that Hamas is good, but I don't agree that they're as bad as many on the pro-Israel side say. Like I don't think they're ISIS. I actually think they're not as bad as ISIS. You could push back on this, but this is an area where I think there's a little propaganda involved.
Well, after October 7th, I was involved in the effort to differentiate between fake news and real news. So one of the things that I was doing, I was working with the civilian Hasbara Corps, whatever, at the time, one of the things that we were doing was looking at videos to determine what was real and what wasn't real. And what we discovered, of course, is like you're saying, a lot of the videos and stories that were coming out were not real. There were stories that were coming out that were from Latin America.
Yeah, Guatemala.
I saw all that. We helped debunk that. But on the other hand, I saw a lot of those things that were real. Like I saw a pregnant woman who they had cut open in Israel after we verified that it was in Israel. And women who had been verifiably raped several times before they were killed and probably after they were killed. And other cases of the worst atrocities that you can imagine. I had the misfortune of seeing the footage of some of these cases. So people ran rampant with things that weren't true, but for no reason, really, because what was true, what did happen, was so horrifying that there was no reason to do it. There's just this enthusiasm to run with a video that'll get you a lot of clicks, whether it's real or not. And some accounts did that without, even when they knew that what they were publishing wasn't real, some just without knowing. But the reality, the real videos, the real atrocities were so horrific, there was absolutely no need for that.
Yeah, I saw the footage as well, but the baby being cut out wasn't verified to be.
There were two cases from Latin America.
Yeah.
Right,
I saw that. It was brutal.
Yeah. One of them was actually a man whose intestines were removed, but it looked like, I don't know if you saw that. Anyway, okay. But there was a woman who's a dead woman on the road. I forget which one of the Yeshuvim it was, who the Hamas people had started to cut her stomach off when the IDF arrived. So, and that was verified. Then there were women who they had put nails in their genitalia while they were still alive after raping them. These things happen. There's no point in pretending they didn't. And I don't think it was an accident. I think that they were told to inflict as much pain and misery on Israelis as they could. And then as far as the rapes of the hostages are concerned, I think there's good reason to be concerned that the people that they're not releasing, the women they're not releasing, there's reasons they're not releasing them in that regard, or that they killed them, the women who before they could tell their stories. Israeli intelligence believes that Hamas is taking that into consideration when they're determining who to release, who not to release, and who to execute.
So I don't know if I want to get stuck on this. People get so upset because it comes off. I have this thing where it's very important for me to speak about things as honestly as possible, but then people say that I'm being an atrocity denialist. But I think that on one hand, atrocity propagandists fuel atrocity denialism, right? Any claim that's made that isn't verified is then used against us. Like I'll tell you, like I read the UN report, I listened to the testimonials, and I think that there's enough people who said they heard screams or saw something. We do see sexual violence in instances of war, although generally not during raids. It's generally in instances of captivity. You need to think that, like, there's I also think if the sexual violence that occurred, actually, I think most of it came from Gazan civilians, and I'll put that in quotations, because I think they had less discipline. And you think, what kind of civilian is going to take advantage of an open border to go in? It's the craziest people. It's the worst people, right? If you hear that there's an opening in the border and you're going to take advantage of that, that's somebody who's probably, not going in with good intention. They don't have discipline. But when you're getting a command now, like there's a raid, the mission is to kill people and to kidnap people, to think that there would be a command to actually rape, it doesn't make strategic sense, because that is literally, you're being shot at, you're being attacked, and you're now going to like pull your pants down and make yourself vulnerable. Something about that story doesn't add up the way it's being framed. To me, it seems like not a command that happened, making it systemic, but more so, we were talking about lack of discipline. a lot of anger, a lot of rage. Yes, so I think some of the soldiers and civilians came in and opportunistically there was instances of sexual violence, but it's not. I don't think we know this because there was clear forensics evidence. I haven't seen any forensics evidence, and the UN report came back saying the same thing, that they didn't see forensics evidence, not video evidence, or not really good photo evidence. It's simply testimonials. That's really all we're going based on at this point.
Well, no. So first of all, these photos do exist, and I've seen some of them, not all of them. And second of all, we have not testimonials just from victims. We also have the interrogations of members of the Nukhba unit saying that they've been given orders to rape. And then also,
yeah, but a confession when you're in military, that's not. I don't see that as evidence.
And there's also, this is a new trend that we're finding in insurgencies all around the world, especially since the Wagner Group started training organizations around the world, of increased brutality towards civilians involving torture and rape. And the doctrine behind it, behind the Wagner Group idea, is that you also want to break the spirit of your enemy. You don't just want to strategically destroy them. There's psychological torture involved too. And we know that a lot of the Nukhba members were trained in Syria and trained by Russian officers, etc. This is a whole new approach on war, a psychological one that we're going to unfortunately be seeing more and more of in the future. We also saw a little bit of it in Bucha in Ukraine and in other cases, where cruelty is part of the point, where the torture psychologically is part of the point. And that's what you're seeing here. And that there's a naivete behind what you're saying, I think. That I also saw when you talked about how they wouldn't use human shields and you were skeptical about that. There's really no level that these people will not stoop to in order to defeat and hurt Israel. They're willing to have their entire home destroyed in order to hurt us. And that tells you a lot about their psychology. You're thinking about it far too rationally from the perspective of someone who values his home and doesn't want it destroyed. You have to put yourself in this place of someone who's willing to have everything that they have in the world destroyed in order to hurt someone else. And that's what Hamas is.
But so I think if that was the goal, and I think the goal was maximum pain, I think that this was a heavily recorded event. It was there's thousands of hours of footage. They were recording it. They recorded their atrocities and let the world see them, but no recordings of sexual violence. So
there were recordings of sexual violence that were not released at the request of the families, including of an American citizen who was beheaded. There's a lot of videos that you don't seem to be aware of that haven't been released.
I mean, there's the 47 minutes. In those 47 that wasn't released, that's not showing videos of sexual violence. It's showing beheadings and executions.
There's some things that weren't released because the families asked not to. So there's plenty of evidence of sexual violence. What we don't know exactly is where the order came from, that sort of thing. We don't have a chain of command of Hamas or anything like that. But the extent of sexual violence was quite large, was quite significant, and there's really no point in denying it, honestly.
So again, for me, like people get upset whenever I have this conversation, and I understand why, because it can come off as like me trying to. It can come off as unsensitive, but I want people to be very clear of how I approach this. I don't have any interest whatsoever in painting Hamas in a positive light. I would like to see them cease to exist, right? But I struggle to say something with confidence if I myself have not been convinced. So I looked at it very thoroughly. I looked at what was being said, and I just was not entirely convinced. So, and then, again, the UN report also, they said they use language that really, whatever, we don't need to get stuck on this topic. I do hope once the dust settles, we can get more information, but many people do point to the confession and interrogations as proof. And I do want to say that I don't think that can be looked at as proof. I think that when you're being interrogated by the Shabak, they use methods that can get people to say things, even if they're not true. And here's just another anecdote. I sat 10 days in military prison for for smoking weed, and that's not a major crime. And the tactics they used against me for one of their own for such a minor crime gets me to think that, they're going to use shit against somebody far worse than me who just massacred people. So I don't take that as proof. I would have liked, forensics evidence would have been very convincing. Video evidence would have been very convincing. The UN coming out, again, UN or Human Rights Watch or one of these courts looking at the videos, right? You don't need to release it to the public. It get verified by the UN. It was not. To me, when I see that, I'm like, okay, do I think sexual violence occurred? Yes. Would I go as far as like saying, oh, Hamas, they're a bunch of rapists? No, that to me just seems intellectually dishonest, because people want to call the IDF rapists because there's instances of them sexually abusing and raping Palestinians. But again, to me, it seems like a result of lack of discipline and not a command from the top. So I try to be fair in how I describe it. I think that's how I generally look at it.
Well, we certainly don't have proof that it's not coming from the top, because we have these confessions. You can say that they're not. You can the best you can say is that you doubt the veracity of these confessions and orders, which I don't. I think that there's enough evidence of them doing it, enough people saying that they were ordered to do it. The scope of it was too large to have been an accident. I think a lot of the people who were armed and were committing these operations militarily quite successfully were involved in these things and weren't just random people from Gaza. So yeah, I think that Hamas has, I don't know what level the orders come from, but I'm sure that there were orders to commit rape. I think that we definitely have enough compelling evidence of that.
We'll have to agree to disagree on this. I think it was more just a result of a lack of discipline and civilians coming in. But
well, you wanted a debate, at least we got one.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this actually will lead to another area of disagreement. And this is actually an area where I've admitted publicly that I might be wrong about. But you said something that can give hope that this can be a deterrence and it could buy us time. They want 5 years to rebuild, so we could have quiet for 5+ years. Although to get quiet for 5+ years and have them come back stronger with better tech, better weaponry, still doesn't seem worth it unless we can take this 5 years and try to negotiate something lasting with them. And here's where I admit where I might be a little bit naive, but I actually think it's possible to negotiate with Hamas and reach some kind of resolution with them. And one of the things that informs this is the fact that we've seen historically other terror organizations become more moderate over time given certain pressures. We saw it happen with the PLO, right? We're now talking about who will replace Hamas. Well, it's the evolution of the PLO, the Palestinian Authority. We've seen it in other conflicts around the world. I think it's actually possible to negotiate with them and ultimately find a resolution. I'm guessing you don't think that's the case.
No, I don't. There's a few differences between Hamas and the PLO. There's a lot of differences. But first of all, let's start with the fact that in order for the PLO to get more moderate than they were, and there's arguments over how moderate they got, but they definitely got more moderate in the late 80s, early 90s. That's a discernible fact. Was after Israel defeated them in Lebanon, right? One thing that people forget, Lebanon wasn't a very successful war in many ways, but one thing that people forget is that Israel managed to trap the PLO leadership in Beirut and get them to go on exile, something that in Gaza would be considered a massive victory, right? Imagine if, Sinwar and Mohammed Deif went to Tunisia today, everyone in Israel would be celebrating this massive victory. And that's what happened in the Lebanon War. Ariel Sharon surrounded Beirut, got Arafat to leave and go to Tunisia. It was a big humiliation. And the PLO became irrelevant for years. And in order to come back and be relevant again, they were willing to make concessions. So that required military defeat. That's number one. Number two, we have the element of religious fanaticism, which I think that anyone who thinks that that is just lip service is misunderstanding this entire movement. People aren't willing to die like this if they don't have some belief in mystical afterlife, etc. And then we have number three, which is perhaps the most important thing, which is Iran. Iran is the sponsor of Hamas, Hezbollah, all these other organizations, their goal has only been to torpedo peace talks and peace agreements. I would go as far as to say that if it wasn't for Iran, the Oslo process would have had much more of a chance of succeeding. Israel did its part in that too, but Iran has had a major role in that. One of Iran's main goals is to make sure that there's never peace between Israel and the Palestinians, because that's their into the region. Iran has the whole Shiite crescent fantasy of being the dominant force in the Middle East. They're closer to doing that now than ever. I don't think they'll ever succeed, but they're closer now than ever. And the way that they have an into this area is by exploiting the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a real conflict with real grievances for their purposes until the very last drop, right? They're willing to fight to the last Palestinian for this. And if without Iran, there is no Hamas in its current format. So you have to ignore all these different things in order to think that you can have peace with Hamas. And then there's another element that is important to remember. Hamas thinks that it's winning. PLO thought that it was losing. And that's a big difference. Hamas thinks, and if I was Hamas, I might be thinking this too, that Israel is weak, it's divided, it's making constant mistakes, it's losing its position in the world, it's going to eventually lose the support of the United States. They think that Israel will eventually cease to exist and will be replaced by an Islamic caliphate. And that's, to them, that's not just a fantasy. And they may end up being right. They look back at the Crusades and they say, we had to wait 100 years before the Crusaders fell. They lost the support of their allies over in Latin Europe. They lost interest. And the same thing will happen to Israel. We just wait them out. So for all those reasons, I see absolutely no reason for Hamas to make peace with Israel. The only way they can make peace with Israel is if Israel defeated them so comprehensively that they felt they had no other recourse. And even then, I think because of their ideology, they'd be waiting for a moment of weakness from us.
Right. So I agree with you that their strong relationship with martyrdom and the afterlife makes it a particularly challenging enemy to face because, you know, for example, people like to bring up other examples like World War II. We caused enough death and destruction and Japan surrendered. Yeah, but if you feel like you're going to the afterlife and being rewarded as a result of this death and destruction, very different calculation. The reason I'm a little bit more hopeful is, I think leaders are often not as religious as their followers and their soldiers. Two, I think when Hamas was elected, they actually reached out to Israel for a 10-year truce. And the terms of this truce weren't extremely favorable. They were asking for like a full right of return and all sorts of other things. But they did show an interest to have a 10-year truce. Now, some can say this 10-year truce would just buy them time to build up military capabilities. I think that's a legitimate counter to what I'm saying. But it's not like we didn't counter them and say, you know what? You're showing a willingness to negotiate. Let's talk to you. Let's counter and say, look, you won't get full right of return, but maybe we can meet in the middle and get this 10-year truce. And after 10 years of quiet, who knows, maybe we could have extended that far beyond. That to me showed some willingness on their part. And then there was their updating of the charter in 2017. Again, I reviewed the charter on this channel. It's not a great charter, but it's definitely much better than their previous one. It's not calling for the death of Jews, which to me shows at the very least that they want to be more accepted by the international community. Even if it's not a full ideological shift, but just a shift in framing. This shift in framing is because they want legitimacy. They want international legitimacy. So the fact that they seem interested to an extent in international legitimacy means that, at least the way I see it, with certain global pressures, we could get them to reform to an even greater extent. And then I see the world shifting, the fact, the Abraham Accords. Who would have thought 10 years ago that Jews would be safer in Dubai than they are in New York City or many European cities? Normalization with Bahrain and Morocco, inching closer to normalization with Saudi Arabia, even with everything going on. The idea of having this coalition in the Middle East that can also put pressure on Hamas, as well as pressure on Israel to compromise, it seems like there is a path forward to get them to continue reform. And again, this doesn't mean lay down their arms and surrender and accept Israel in its current form. In order for us to meet in the middle, it will require drastic change on Israel's part as well. It will require concessions and compromise, and some that might even cause fear amongst Israelis. But given all that, I actually think there is a path forward. And when I look at like what it requires to take them out militarily, I'm not confident that taking them out militarily is easier or has a higher chance of succeeding than the path of diplomacy. And with that, I'll once again say that I actually, even though I'm leaning towards this being true, I recognize that I might be overly optimistic in our ability to do this.
Yeah, yeah. So you definitely are, in my opinion. So a lot of Hamas's more moderate moves, we now know, were an attempt to lull Israel into a false sense of security before this attack. Hamas was playing a lot of games leading up to this. And, you know, the right wingers keep talking about the conceptia that the government had, the concept, the false concept, and they're using that as a blanket term to include a lot of things. But there was a false concept, and it has a lot to do with what you were saying. In 2017, Hamas did change their charter, and they started making a lot of noises of we're trying to build up Gaza. We're the responsible sovereign in Gaza, and they used the Islamic Jihad very cleverly as sort of, oh, these are the bad guys. We try to control them. And Israel was fighting wars only against Islamic Jihad. If you remember, they were bombing only Islamic Jihad. And the new Israeli news was full of, Hamas are helping us. Hamas are stabilizing. Hamas, we don't want to hurt Hamas targets. What it turns out is that Hamas was using that all the time as cover for a massive surprise attack that they hoped would have severe strategic ramifications on Israel and would change the entire picture, because their maximalist demands are their actual demands. They're not just saying that. We can't just pretend that they're saying different things from what they're saying. And their moderation, such as it is, are attempts, like you admitted, to build their military capabilities, which they had very little of when they took over Gaza. What did they have? They had nothing. And in order to trick Israel into letting its guard down, which it did incredibly well. So well that Hamas was able to waltz in, take over the entire Ugdat Aza headquarters, one of the most humiliating moments in Israeli military history. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Go in there and slaughter everyone, because Israel thought that Hamas had become a responsible governing adult. I never fully bought that, but I definitely bought it to some extent. I thought it was, I never thought that Hamas gave up their dreams of ruling turning all of Israel into an Islamic caliphate. But I thought they're thinking, well, we're running Gaza now, so right now we'll focus on that. That I thought. I was wrong even about that. Their maximalist demands are the core of their ambitions. And if you want more evidence of that, look at their negotiations right now with the Palestinian Authority. It's fascinating. Abbas is meeting with Hamas officials in Qatar all the time, in Doha. And what they're telling him is, we're willing to let you rule Gaza if you let us keep our arms. So let us keep our arms and keep preparing to destroy Israel. You rule Gaza. Ruling Gaza really isn't for us. It's a pain in the ass we don't need. Killing Israelis, that's what we're about. That's what they want to keep. And that tells you everything you need to know about their ambitions. You're making a fundamental mistake in understanding what Hamas is about. Hamas exists to hurt Israel. They have no real other reason to exist. That's it.
Yeah, I think people are generally not, their ideology isn't often as deep rooted as we think, and given certain conditions, people change their minds. And I think that one of the reasons why I don't disagree with you with their strategy of like making it seem like things are good and then doing the surprise attack. And one of the reasons why October 7th was so successful is because we didn't expect it, even with the intelligence we got. right? I recently did the last live stream I did was October 7th an inside job, and the analysis I did was it was not, even though we were warned that it was happening. We get warnings all the time, but we didn't think after 2 years of calm, after just increasing the amount of Gazans that could come in Israel for work, that they're just going to attack. And if they do, our military will be able to deal with it, right? So it was more a level of, call it arrogance. It was more arrogance than malice, right? That was our mistake, thinking that it's not going to happen, and that if it does, we could stop it. But I think that it's not like we have given them much of a path to anything but violence, aside from just surrender and accepting Israel's right to exist in its current formation. It's not like we've had we've reached out, say, whenever you want, we're willing to negotiate, we're willing to compromise. No, we've maintained the status quo, we've maintained a siege, we haven't given them another option. So yeah, they took the path of violence. But I do think with using international pressure, not only working with international pressure, but even domestic pressure, right? So Gazans don't like Hamas generally, and we even have Fahed here in the comments. Fahed is a Gazan who's been on the show. They don't like Hamas. They just like them more than us, right? And the reason they like them more than us is because their only experience with Israel is what we do to them every few years, us mowing the lawn. So we consistently reinforce what they're taught in their schools, that we are the real enemy, and that even though they don't love Hamas, at least they're doing something against us. So we don't use international pressure. We don't use domestic pressure by proving to them consistently that we're the bad guy. And it seems like if we can work to not only show Gazans that we have their best interest in mind, but also work with the international community to put pressure on Hamas, I think we could get them to reform. I think that often leaders care more about their own self-preservation than they do whatever ideology they are promoting to activate their base. And I think that if Sinwar, what's the head of the political bureau in what's his name? Hania. If they were both really feeling the pressure and felt like their power, their maintenance of power was dependent on them making compromises, I have a feeling that they would shift. Again, we won't know if we don't try. It doesn't seem like we're going to try, but not trying has really led us here. So it's like we have two options. We could continue down this route and we see where it's leading, or we could try something radically different and maybe we'll fail, but at least we'll fail knowing that we gave it a full effort to try to make it work. So that's
So I agree with you that the current route we're going on is terrible. And I agree with you that we need to try something radically different. I'm just not sure why on earth that route would be to try to talk to Hamas. The route to take would be to try to destroy Hamas militarily and politically and replace them with a reformed Palestinian Authority where you root out the corruption and you change their attempts to lead to incitement. And then Israel also stops building settlements, dismantles settlements, commits itself to a two-state solution. What you need to do, forgive me for being simplistic, is you want to encourage the moderates, strengthen the moderates, and weaken the extremists. Same thing in Israel. Same thing in Israel. Imagine if I took your argument and reversed it around Israel. What if instead of replacing the Ben Gvir and Smotrich, we gave them more power and talked to them and normalized them and gave them more money? Would that bring peace? No, they're insane. These people are insane. Ben Gvir and Smotrich, no matter how much money and power you gave them, would not all of a sudden become moderate. And the same thing for Hamas. What you have to do is you have to crush the extremists. You have to replace them. You have to strengthen the moderates. And to some extent, what Israel's been doing, it's not exactly what you're saying, but to some extent, Israel's been strengthening Hamas intentionally so that they don't have to make deals with the moderates. That's been the mistake. It's not even that radically different for Israel to work with Hamas. It's been working with Hamas for years. Israel's been giving suitcases of money to Hamas from Qatar, and it's been helping them establish their rule. And meanwhile, Israel is constantly weakening the PA. It's strengthening the extremists and weakening the moderates, because the more extreme the Palestinians are, the less chance there is of peace talks, the more mandate there is for the right wing because there's terror attacks. They thrive on the instability. So what Israel's doing wrong is not engaging with Hamas. What Israel's been doing wrong for a good 10 years is engaging too much with Hamas. Hamas should not exist. Hamas should not be ruling Gaza. The goal of the war in Gaza should have been from day one, more than anything else, to replace Hamas as the ruling government in Gaza. That should have been goal number one, number two, number three. Everything else is a lot less important. Bringing in a moderate government that Israel can work with and move towards a Palestinian state and move towards normalization with Saudi Arabia and move towards a better future for the region. But that path to a better future in no way moves through Hamas. Hamas has to be eliminated for that, and Iran has to be weakened because Iran is an incredible impediment to everything that you're talking about. So I completely disagree. Hamas cannot be part of the equation. It's fine if there's some Hamas people running around with guns. It's not good, but you can't avoid that. So when people say destroy Hamas as in kill every member of Hamas, that's not happening. But removing them from power, ISIS was removed from power in northern Syria, in northern Iraq. Even the Taliban were removed from power in Afghanistan. They'd still be out of power if the United States had kept its soldiers there. It can be done. Gaza is tiny. It's not a problem. The only reason that they're still in power is because Israel decided that they will remain in power for political reasons. There's no reason to keep Hamas in power. There's no reason to talk to them. There's no reason to accept them. None at all.
So I think there's some area of agreement here. We agree that defeating them militarily, just killing all, it seems like there's this perception, you see it a lot on Twitter and in Israeli society, we're going to keep fighting until there's none left, but people don't even take into consideration their ability to recruit. The more civilians die, the easier it is to recruit new soldiers. The U.S. fought the Taliban for over 20 years. The moment they left, they came back to power. But I do, and I do agree with you that one possible outcome, and right now we have the option to do it, is really to replace them. Now, in order to replace them requires we see tens of thousands of dead civilians, and when all is said and done, probably 1,000 plus dead soldiers. Maybe that's even being conservative. In order to replace them, I see that as a viable option. I think that would be at the expense of bringing the hostages back. But the amount of death and destruction you need to achieve that is much greater than had we been able to do it through diplomacy. So you're absolutely convinced there's no way to do it through diplomacy. So you gravitate towards saying, you know what? If a few tens of thousands of civilians need to die and 1,000 plus soldiers need to die, but that's the best option, you gravitate towards that. And I can understand that. Me being a little bit more optimistic, I gravitate towards saying, let's try the path of least destruction first. If the path of least destruction fails after a true valiant effort which has not been done, not even close, then I think that there's a stronger justification for engaging in actions that are going to cause harm. Now, this is like a lot of this is theoretical because we're in a sense past that now. We're in Gaza, so the question is what we could do now. And so you suggested we end the war, right? We get the hostages back, but then we're not replacing Hamas. We're keeping them in power.
Yeah. So I think that ending the war now is what we need to do because we have the current government in power that is not willing to do what needs to be done in Gaza. If we had a government, perhaps if it was led by Benny Gantz, I'm not sure he would really have the cojones to do this either. But if we had a government that
he's not some revolutionary thinker.
He's not. Yeah, he has pretty good instincts, but he's not a revolutionary thinker.
Yeah.
He has a lot of issues. We can talk about that if you want.
He's even in certain instances more hawkish than Bibi, which is interesting.
Well, he's a lot like me. I'm very hawkish when I think that being hawkish helps create a better future that could lead to peace. And I'm very not hawkish when I believe that violence is useless. Okay. So we share a worldview in many ways. Not always. So if you want what I think, when the war started, I fully supported it. At first, I thought that Israel was going to do what it had to do, despite the fact that it was Netanyahu. I gave him benefit of the doubt. But I realized after, I don't know, maybe a month after the invasion, that there was really no intent to do what had to be done, which is replace Hamas. If you're not going to replace Hamas, the war has no point but to create some deterrence. I'm not buying this whole humanitarian bubble plan. I don't think anyone really is. Not in the, maybe they mean it, but it's just not sustainable. It's not a government. The soldiers there will be completely isolated. There won't be support from the international community. It's just asking for failure. So I don't support what this government is doing in terms of trying to have a day after solution. Think of World War II. A lot of people compare this to World War II. They compare Hamas to Nazis and what Israel's doing to what the Allies did and all that. Imagine if the Allies went into Stuttgart and then pulled out, went into Berlin and then pulled out, went into Munich and then pulled out. And that was how they wanted to defeat the Nazis. The Nazis would still be there today. That's not how you win a war. You have to occupy all of Gaza. You have to put in a new government. You have to get agreement from the international community. Israel certainly can't do this alone. And then have some kind of mechanism for negotiating a two-state solution and for exiting. That's how you could win this war. Do I think Israel could have done that? Yes. Would I support that? 100%. But if Israel's not going to do that, and it ain't, then I think it's time to cut our losses, get the hostages, and declare we deterred Hamas, we degraded Hamas, and avoid a massive war in Lebanon,
right?
Because the alternative is terrible.
And then, so in your opinion, and then in like 5 to 10 years, we go back, hopefully with better leadership, and replace them. That's what you'd like to see done?
Well, yeah. I don't trust this leadership to do anything right. And hopefully future leadership will be better. If not, if future leaderships are not going to be better, then we might have bigger problems than Hamas in 10 years anyway. You know, the country needs to be run by people who actually care
right.
about the country. Israel doesn't have the margin of error that the U.S. has of, you know, being misrun for 20 years and then still existing. But yeah, I think you and I both know, regardless of the fact that we have different goals for this war, whatever the goals are, this government is not capable of achieving them. Yeah.
I mean, we've seen that. And so I tend to agree with you. It's time to cut our losses, stop, end the escalation in the north and potentially a greater regional escalation. The one difference is I think we should take this time to get back to the negotiating table, even if it fails, because there's very little cost in making a valiant effort, especially now.
Not with Hamas. That's where I differ with you.
Yeah. I think we should be.
The PA. You talked about talking to Hamas. We should not be talking to Hamas about a future state. That will just completely eliminate the PA, which, Netanyahu would benefit from that too. The PA needs to be strengthened. If the PA collapses, we'll have Hamas in the West Bank. The last thing that they're going to do when the West Bank turns into a Hamas fiefdom is want to negotiate with Israel. They'll think we're one step closer to eliminating Israel, and they'll be right. So we need to strengthen the PA and talk to them. You want to talk to someone, talk to them.
Right, but that would require another operation in Gaza in order to replace them, right? So we're saying that in 5 to 10 years we need to go back with a similar level of force, similar level of civilian death toll. Maybe we could be more careful. Although the more careful we are, the higher the soldier death toll, which hard to see Israel, at least in its current state, agreeing to something like that in order to replace them. So that's essentially by refusing to even try to negotiate with them using domestic and international pressures, it's essentially saying we're going to need to destroy Gaza once again in 5 to 10 years.
Well, what are you going to negotiate with them about now? I mean, the release of the hostages and the end of the war is what they want to talk about. What is it you want to talk to them about? They don't control the West Bank anyway. We can't resolve the entire conflict with Hamas, even if we wanted to.
Yeah.
Willing to.
we need to return to the negotiating table with both parties, and we need to show, right, one of our biggest mistakes. And by the way, we're going to wrap it up soon. We'll take a few questions. So whoever has a question, please ask. We'll prioritize super chats. But one of our mistakes is that we showed that to some extent, even if you're a moderate government that has recognized Israel, like the PA has, that's still not going to lead to a free Palestine, right? Like
That's what we agree.
Yeah. Many
That's what we
Palestinians,
completely agree.
right? We haven't proven that being more moderate is actually good.
Quite the opposite. We punish moderation. We reward terrorism. The deal that Netanyahu made with Gilad Shalit, whatever deal they're going to make now, all that is rewarding terrorism constantly. And then the same people who support the government that does that said it'll be a surrender to terrorism to give concessions to the Palestinian Authority. And that's a complete misunderstanding of the situation. You're constantly rewarding terrorism and punishing moderation. You're punishing yourself.
Yeah. And, we've also have, I often say here, and people get upset that, Palestinian resistance has been primarily violent and primarily targeting civilians. But there has been instances of peaceful resistance, but Israel just shut those down, jailed them. Like we've had this thing where we say, why are you acting violently? But then when there's a peaceful resistance, it's not like we're accepting of that. Now,
no, the goal of Israeli policy, and there's no other way to look at it, is to prevent the existence of a Palestinian state. The Palestinians see that, and the government increasingly says so, and Palestinians are responding to that. That's just a fact. That's something that needs to change.
And to over time expand more into our historic homeland. We see this happening. The expansionist segment of Israeli society, really, even though I don't even think they're the majority, because of a lack of hope from the general Israeli public, they become indifferent to expansionism. So even if it's 20% that want to expand, they have a lot of energy and motivation. So they're consistently successful. And Palestinian violence only fuels expansionism, right? That's what we see.
To punish the terrorism will build more settlements. That'll fuel more terrorism and give more targets to terrorism. Then we'll punish that by building more settlements, which will cause more terrorism.
Right. We punish the terrorists by creating more terrorists, right? It's really been our policy. Now, I do think that one thing we could do is we can counter, right? They're doing something interesting. And this is one of the areas where the negotiations break down. They're saying, we don't want a lasting ceasefire. We want a permanent ceasefire. It's like, okay, what does a permanent ceasefire mean? Forever? So if there's going to be so Israel should actually come back and say, okay, permanent ceasefire. So let's have mutual recognition of each other's right to exist. And we need to figure out the details. But let's sign this peace agreement and have that be the beginning of a new negotiation. I think that is an interesting counter that we should attempt. So it's not, right now they're asking for something a little bit more dovish than even we want. We want lasting, they want permanent. Okay, so let's up the ante. You want permanent? Fine. Recognize us. We'll recognize the Palestinian state, which we still have never done. We need to work out the borders, the logistics of right of return and what that actually looks like. But let that be how we end this round of violence.
Yeah. If we don't move towards a two-state solution at the end of this, which we won't, then we're just waiting for the next round, and the next round may be even less favorable than this one.
Yeah. Cool. So we'll take some questions. I'm going to throw out one of the questions because I'm interested in hearing your thoughts. But first, Floodland99, thanks for the $5 super chat. Do you think Netanyahu can go down in history as the man who destroyed Israel? If Israel gets destroyed, then yeah, he will be that man. What do you think?
Yes. Netanyahu is going to go down in history as the worst leader Israel ever had. If he's lucky, he will be seen as a nadir that Israel recovered from, and if we're lucky, and if we're not lucky, then he will be seen as a tragic hero, one of the most important figures in Jewish history, the one who destroyed the third temple, as Moshe Dayan called Israel. Maybe there'll be a holiday where he's cursed or something like that, where people eat a lot of food 2,000 years from now. Yeah, he's such a impressive figure on the one hand and such a flawed figure on the other. And the mistakes he made have had such influence. And, Yeah, and it's not just this war. I think that Israelis are aware that what he's done by dividing the country, starting with, it's a legacy of division, starting with the demonstrations in Zion Square with Rabin, in the SS uniform back in '95, all the way to trying to destroy the Supreme Court, the country that he found as a politician and the country that he left is so different, and so much of it is because of the division that he caused, division that I'm not sure that Israel can even survive. And I'm not. October 7th might not even be the worst thing that he's done to the country.
Yeah, let's hope he's not remembered as the man who destroyed Israel, because Israel continues to exist, but we're going to need some major shifts in how we go about things. Another question. This is for me. Have you, what do you think of like a federation solution?
Well, I think that considering the threats that the Jewish people face, what really determines whether Israel exists or not is its military, its military force. We've seen that in the Middle East, if you're a minority group without military force, you end up getting slaughtered. Look at the Yazidis, look at the Kurds, look at the Assyrians, Copts, so on and so forth. So what really matters in the structure of the state is what security it provides for the Jews living in it. And any sort of federation that doesn't provide that kind of security will not be acceptable to the Israeli people, and I believe would also be a mistake and would be unworkable. So the devil is in the details in these sorts of things. To me, federation would suggest that they share foreign policy and security policy while having internal domestic autonomy. And I don't think that would be workable at all for the reasons that I said, because then what happens if Israel is at war and then you have a military that represents different ethnicities? Well, we have a pretty good idea of what happens from Lebanon. In Lebanon, we have a military in a country where, one commander has to be Druze and one commander has to be Sunni, and the Shiite has to be the one who cleans the toilets or whatever their scheme is in the military. And the end result is the military can't function. The Hezbollah goes and fights the Christians, or the Christians fight the Palestinians, or whatever's happening. The army hides in its barracks because it's politically unable to operate. So, I have my background is in military strategy, so that's the first thing I look at. But I think that's the most important element. So if you're talking about a shared foreign policy, shared military, it's not going to work. It's a pipe dream, and it won't be acceptable to Israelis.
Right. So I like the federation solution for many reasons, but that I think is what you bring up is one of the biggest concerns. And I would say that if we go down the path of federation, the shared military, it would need to be like a multi-generational thing. Like it would need to take time. I think it starts with like other smaller steps. So you can have like a 20-year plan until you have like the shared military. But first you could just start with like more local autonomy, increase the freedom of movement. Hold on. There's like a runners group, a bunch of runners. Okay, cool. Appreciate the effort. So it seems like there's certain, and this is a tension. You hear many like the Palestinians, they say end the occupation and we'll give you peace, and we say give us peace and we'll end the occupation, right? There's like this desire to first have full freedom on the entire land and then there'll be peace, and we're like whoa, we don't want to die, and we're not gonna do something that is gonna lead to an existential threat. We're just not going to. Call us racist, call us apartheid. We'd rather be called racist in an apartheid state than be dead, right? So say whatever you want. We're not going to put ourselves in danger. So I do wonder if there's a way to construct a federation that doesn't cause an existential threat. And over time, once there's, a process of reconciliation, we could get there. Again, this could just be too much of an idealist solution, but it does seem over time the two-state solution becomes less and less tenable. The fact that the majority of both populations don't seem to support it anymore, and and you have just what would a Palestinian state look like with this many amount of settlers? How do you remove them if that's what you decide to do? So I'm trying to be realistic, you know. So it's like, well, we need to find some solution, you know.
Yeah, well, we need to start talking. We need to start talking, and if we start talking and building confidence, then these things will be more possible. But that requires Hamas to be removed from power, and that requires Israel to stop with its settlements and its attempts to destroy the PA. Then we can start talks. Certainly, talks about a federation seem premature, but I mean, ultimately, if Israel can maintain its security for the Jewish people and its identity in any format, I'm for it. Right now, for the reasons I said, I don't think it's workable. I think Israel exists in the Middle East on its sword. We've exaggerated that it needs to exist only on its sword and use no other tools at all.
Right.
That is a terrible mistake. We have all these other tools, but the military remains our most important tool, because without that tool, we just wouldn't exist.
Right.
And that's the main problem with the federation, because it involves, from what I've seen of other federations, a shared security apparatus, which Israel cannot afford to create.
We've needed our military to exist, and we still need it to exist, but it's time to recognize that that alone will not ensure our survival here on the land.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
Yeah. Just a comment from Fahed, our Gazan friend, says in Gaza they listen to Hebrew music. Interesting. Okay.
What did they listen to?
Fair. No, I'm sure there's some good Lebanese artists and stuff. And anyways, Shaiel, this was great. I'd love to have you back on again at some point, just for another round. This was awesome.
Sure.
Thank you all for tuning in. We'll be back next week for another stream.